Okay, welcome to today's session of the Populism Seminar. We have the concluding roundtable on anti-populism as a way to react to populism with three absolutely exciting speakers. Just to briefly remind you, the Populism Seminar is an initiative by Annika Werner from the Australian National University, Andres Saslova and Maurits Myers from Rockbound University in Nijmegen, and my name is Robert Huber. I'm a postdoc at the University of Salzburg at the moment. So today we have Kirk Hawkins, one of the established stars in the field, sharing his views, and more recently started working on mitigation strategies to populism. The same holds for Leonie, one of the rising stars in the field, providing a lot of interesting perspectives. And with Giorgos, we already saw maybe today on Twitter his extensive tweet on anti-populism and his views on the field and how to react to it. Just to give you a couple of house rules or ground rules before we start. As always, we record this webinar session and we will post the video on our YouTube channel and on our website. Please either use the Q&A function to post a question, or you can raise your hand and we can open your mic afterwards. So without much further ado, let me hand over to Kirk to start off the roundtable.
Thanks, Robert. Give me a second. I'll share some slides with you all. I think that's it. Robert, can you see those slides?
Yes, excellent.
Great. So yeah, thanks for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you today about the effective, appropriate responses to populism. And I'm going to outline today what I call a pluralist response. And in doing this, I will be sharing a little bit of our research here, but for the scholars among us who maybe don't feel the same keen policy interest, there's a kind of a little theoretical bite to this that I'll try to introduce at the start with this concept of pluralism, where I'm going to try to lay it out a little more clearly than we sometimes see in the literature on populism. So let me go ahead and give you this great example of what I think is a bad approach to populism. So this was in an email that a colleague of mine got, and he immediately forwarded this to me, and he said, "Kirk, is this populist? This really looks populist." And I said, "Yes, it is." And I just love this. Of course, it's around this issue right now in the US, this sort of strange but very pressing problem right now of a shortage of baby formula because of a variety of things happening. But the way they frame this, right? This is what happens when an economy is built around lining the pockets of the wealthy elite instead of supporting workers and their families, et cetera. And so as you read the rest of that, I'm sure you're looking at that right now thinking, oh, yeah, that's fairly textbook populism. But you may notice here, and the Fairness Project is a nonprofit here, one of these political nonprofits, 501c, as we say here in the United States, that is actually left progressive. It emerged out of health worker unions in California and has undertaken a variety of causes, ballot initiatives in some states around left progressive stances. And so here they are using populism to kind of sell their views. And so, well, yeah, I mean, in the current US context, then you think of this is a populist response to populism. So if we have a kind of a dominant right populism, at least under Trump and his followers still now, some on the left then will respond to him with their own version of that. And, I hear echoes here of Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders as I read this. And what I want to say is this isn't, we don't have to do this. I mean, and I don't think we should. And it helps maybe if we outline an alternative. And to think of some alternatives, it's fun to think of some recent examples. I could have drawn from some from the past, but I thought I would bring up some of these now. So in Turkey, with the People's Republican Party, this recent thing from the 2019 municipal elections where they created a campaign of radical love. And this is the cover of the book they used to teach their activists, their campaign activists, as they were to go out and approach people on the street to make these contacts during the campaign that they needed to approach things differently and use a very different strategy. It was not a populist strategy they used. And, this got a lot of press, I think, rightfully so. Whether that's something they can maintain, whether it, in the end will win all their elections, is tricky, but definitely a different strategy. And at least in the short term there, it seemed to work for them. Another one here in the US, I've got to kind of trump up an organization that my wife and I, actually, we both work together with this a bit in some of our research now. It's an NGO called Braver Angels, and they deal with depolarization. And one of the things they do that's different, and I think highlights what I'm going to say now about this pluralist approach, is, a lot of these organizations right now do something that I find distasteful and boring, which is to adopt a kind of a middling, compromised response that just tries to bring everybody together and say, oh, look at all this we have in common, ignore all of our differences, and just see how much we have in common, stop hating each other, done. This organization, they do a bit of that, what we call contact theory in some of their seminars, but they also have these communication workshops where they just try to teach people how to talk to their neighbors, how to talk to their constituents in ways that don't arouse anger, but instead allow them to listen better and to show respect, even as they express differences of opinion about issues. And what exactly that civility means. And I like that. I think they embody both of this approach that I want to talk about, a pluralist one. So to do this, now here's the academic part, right? I'm going to say, when we talk about populism as a discourse, we should always remember that it's part of a typology of discourses. So, you don't just have a populist thin-centered ideology, if you want to call it that way, but what are the other isms there? And, Kasmuda and myself and others, we've used some words to describe those things. And pluralism is a really significant one. When we code speeches for populism, what's in the other column? One of these opposites of populism is pluralism. And we don't always stop to think, well, what does it exactly consist of? And so let me just remind you of what one of these alternatives, and I have to say populism and pluralism are not the only two in this field. There are others too. We could talk about nationalism, for example, or patriotism, and even another sort of non-discourse I'll call, technocratic kind of talk. So this to clarify, when Laclau talked about this a few years ago, right, he talked about populism as this best example of a politics of hegemony. And the alternative, he said, there's just like one alternative, is a politics of differences. And it's this sort of bland world where we overlook deep differences of opinion. And as critics have rightly said, right, it's like a world without politics. And that doesn't seem realistic or helpful as a way of thinking about democracy. And I think that's right. But in our work looking at speeches where you actually see lots of text and what people say in politics, I think what Laclau described is really just one version of this, what I would call a technocratic kind of discourse, one in which, frankly, the normative implications of things are kind of repressed or submerged or not considered, right? It really is just sort of about administrative matters. If you can imagine the most boring, state of the nation speech, that would be something very technocratic, something really boring, just giving the figures and the numbers. In some ways, me talking right now is very technocratic. Pluralism is different. It is a redemptive kind of discourse. And this, again, I want to emphasize, this is something we see in speeches. Some of my favorite examples from these actually come from presidents right after democratic transitions at the start of the third wave. So I'm thinking of some figures in Latin America who would use these in these opening speeches, that would start their new democratic term in office, or that would be part of their political campaign. And it was not technocratic at all. It was talking about the normative significance of things. And so specifically some of the content of this, if we think about, it's sort of cosmology here, we say it's very universalistic. It doesn't try to demonize the other side. Instead, it sees a variety of opinions. It does admit those differences of opinion. It says, I feel one way, my opponent feels a very different way. And that's okay, because you know what, that is. And so it's accepting some of Laclau and Moufi's critiques, saying, well, yeah, we do have differences of opinion. These are inevitable, and we need to deal with these. We don't just sweep them under the rug. But it does avoid demonizing opponents. So you have to admit that there's a kind of humility to it, where you say, well, I may not be 100% right about things, and my opponents may not be 100% wrong about them. And so I don't want to demonize them. That's not the appropriate approach to this. So that's a little bit of the content of pluralism. what is this? And I'm going quick here because I want to give everybody a chance to speak. But so if I take those ideas, if I say that's a nice discourse you talked about, but I mean, what would that look like in practice as something that a leader could say, or that I could speak to my neighbor as I talk about politics? And part of this is that it's a recognition that if there are differences of opinion that are legitimate, that, even the populists themselves may have some grievances that are legitimate. Now, I may not say maybe they bring some racism into that. Maybe they bring paranoia into this, right? They are demonizing their opponents, including me, and I don't like that. I don't think that's right. But at the same time, maybe they're concerned because, they feel like national borders are a little too porous and their national identities aren't being respected and celebrated. And you think, well, I don't know, maybe they have a point about that. Yeah, I mean, maybe their jobs are a little under threat. And is that fair to them? If as citizens, my fellow citizens, they're being asked to bear the brunt of these things, and I, as someone with a PhD, maybe it's not so hard on me, and I should see that. So it's understanding there may be some legitimate grievances, and an effort to identify those, I think, flows from this pluralist appreciation of things. Along with that, you'd say, well, how can I speak to somebody who I'm trying to understand their grievances and not demonize them? So to not demonize, what does that look like? And I think a good clues here come from a literature on conflict resolution. And this is something that for some of us as comparativists in political science and as theorists, we're not always familiar with this literature. In political science, it comes to us actually from international relations. They use this quite a bit when they study conflict mediation. If we go into legal studies here in the United States, that's another place where they teach this in law school. Not research psychologists, if you will, but clinical psychologists use this quite a bit, right? Therapists use this all the time, these techniques. And what do these consist of? I'll get just quick examples. One of the key ones is the idea of active listening, that you have to listen to people, not, and well, these are very specific practical suggestions, that you don't just listen to people with the intent to immediately counter their argument, right? So you don't go into it saying, okay, what are they going to say so that I can destroy them. When I respond now, you say, no, I'm going to listen to them because I want to understand what they're saying. And so that means actually like listening to them. And the second thing, this is very practical, this is what they teach you in a marriage therapy session, is you say, oh, well, I have to be able to restate what you just told me until I get it to the point that you say, yeah, that's right? So your opponent should say, yeah, you got it right, thanks, and so that's what it means to engage in active listening. So that's a technique of communication we could be using. It'd be a very pluralist technique of communication. Another one is the idea that is that you do get to share your opinion, and you need to be able to say, well, my views on this are the following, and now again, you got to be careful. You go into it saying, I'm going to listen to you. And if there's no chance for me to share my view, that's the way it goes. I want to listen to you first. But at some point, you're going to ask me, well, what do you think, Kirk? And okay, well, and then there's a way I can do this that doesn't offend, and I guess that, again, doesn't demonize my opponents. Some classic, typical techniques, right? If I say use I statements, many of you are going to say, oh yeah, I've heard of that. Well, that's what you should be doing here in these political conversations, to say, well, the way I see it is a pluralist response is going to be more effective. I think that populism, so again, trying to couch these things using I statements. Some other examples, right, would be, not to, kind of use gotcha questions when you're talking to somebody, to just kind of recognize some humility as you speak, to recognize your idea may not even be right, and so you should speak about it a little that way. So how you represent yourself and your views. You should express them. This is not a discourse of technocracy. It's not meant to be a politics of differences. This is like real deep-seated differences of belief we have here. And you need to be able to express those, but there are good ways of doing it and bad ways. And then out of all of this can come, again, this idea of, I could identify some grievances, and along the way, I might be able to say, hey, you know what, you radical right populist, I think you're kind of despicable in some ways. I'm not going to say that, right? But I disagree with you on some of the points you've raised. I don't see immigrants that way. But you know what? We both care about making our communities stronger and more livable places. And I really appreciate that, right? To be able to say, we recognize differences, but also if there is something in common, right? This is good mediation, good diplomacy. You do also want to acknowledge that. And that's part of what the conversation can lead to. There might be some compromise positions that are possible, and that would be a great thing to be able to come out with those if you can. All right, so I have to emphasize all of this. It's got this practical focus of saying, I want to identify the populist grievance because maybe, right, there's some lesson for our policy solutions. But also, this was the other point of it, right? As you're speaking, and especially as you're listening, you signal a fundamental respect for the other person. That's hard to do, right? If I have someone on the other side, a populist there, and I think you're bigoted, I think you're crazy, and how do I deal with that? I mean, I don't want to legitimate some of your views, but as a human being, I need to be able to accept you and say, well, you are, at the end of the day, I mean, you're a fellow citizen, and I got to kind of respect that. Listening does that. It's really powerful. We've worked this, as Robert pointed out, in some of our research, and there's a kind of strategy we're trying to use. The idea here is that, unlike your typical approach where you go out and you do these little workshops of 20 people and you imagine you're going to save the world, right, by doing one workshop after another where you bring citizens together. I'm not a big fan of that approach. I don't think they have the reach they need. I don't think they're practical. The idea is instead you teach these principles kind of to change makers. So you look for community activists, you look for the politicians, wow, or their staffers, and say, what if I teach you these principles and then you go out and teach it to other people? And this is, I think, part of the genius of the radical love approach in Turkey, was to say, what if we teach this to our campaign workers and have them do this? So I think that approach, to me, that actually makes sense, because I think that can be scaled up. And we have a university course module we are using right now. This, again, is like the opposite of what I said. I mean, trying to train, the leaders of the future is sort of a futile thing. We're talking about, millions of people in the United States. But anyway, we're trying it out. We've got a university course module that we've been using in some classes we teach here on our campus. It's a week-long module. Teach them the skills, encourage them to go out and use them. Students actually report really liking these a lot. They use them in non-political ways, sometimes, as a way to improve their conversations with their boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse, and so not necessarily politically, but they do seem to work. And also Braver Angels, they've teamed up with Ballotpedia, and they're actually trying to teach these right now to congressional staffers. And I thought, wow, that's a real move up for them to be able to do that. And I'm kind of encouraged. I mean, I hope that getting in there and doing that will work. In our research, we've been impressed by politicians we've seen who kind of intuitively know these techniques already, and they use them well with their constituents. One of my favorites is actually our member of Congress, our representative in the House of Representatives here in my part of Utah. He's this remarkable politician. His background is that he worked in sales for Citizen Watch for like 20 years. He was their best salesman in the United States. And as a salesman, he's very good at listening to his customers and his clients and just saying, oh, I understand, I see, is this okay? Yeah, because right, as a salesman, he had to be able to do this to win them over, to be able to sell them a product. And as a politician, he does this really effectively. He actually holds, get this, 40 meetings a year with his constituents, right? He comes here and does these little open houses with them. Something that most politicians in the United States absolutely avoid like a plague, because they're so uncontrollable, so scary, and they have so many angry constituents. He loves going to these settings because he's got these skills down, and he's able to go in and he listens to them. And he just listens, and his voters, these constituents, come out. The guy's a moderate Republican here in a fairly conservative state, but he makes it work really well because he does an awful lot of just listening. So, okay, and that's it.
Thanks a lot, Kirk, for sharing your insights and this nice presentation, giving us really practical a practical perspective. I will hand over to Leonie and already remind the audience that you can already type your questions in the Q&A function or write them down and then raise your hand a bit later. So Leonie, the floor is yours.
There we go. I had to find the unmute button. All right, I'm ready to go. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and thanks, Kirk, for starting us off. I had a lot of fun thinking about this question about is anti-populism the way to react to populism, and more generally responses to populism. And so before going into any detail on what I think the right response is, I think some caveats are in order, and I will start with those. I mean, to just sort of start us right off, I think anti-populism, to respond directly to the question, certainly isn't the way forward. And I think Benjamin Moffat wrote an excellent piece in The Guardian about 2 years ago in which he laid out all the pitfalls of this type of logic. But I wanted to start off with just 3 reasons as to why I think anti-populism does not work. And the first is that anti-populism is often driven by this sort of staunch liberal individualism that doesn't believe in unifying collective identities against those in power. And I think that that's simply not how politics works. A second point is that anti-populism is often motivated by a similarly misguided belief that politics is ultimately this very rational activity where career politicians debate one another in a very sober and mature fashion, ideally finding some consensus, and often that consensus then ends up being at the lowest common denominator. And I think that that is actually what gives rise to populism in the first place. So because of that, I think that that is not the way to respond to populism. So when thinking about responses to populism, I would say, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater to start with. Now, if anti-populism isn't the way forward, then of course, what is? To answer this question, I think we first need to agree on where the problem really lies. And in my work, I focus on a specific type of populist actor. And specifically, I focus on populist radical right parties. So these parties are first and foremost characterized by nativism and authoritarianism, which, taken together, right, nativism is this belief that this sort of strong sense of nationalism, an exclusionary form of nationalism that indeed doesn't leave any room for pluralism. And that authoritarianism is this strict belief in hierarchical societies, that the societies need to be ordered strictly in a hierarchical fashion, and that there needs to be law and order. And taken together, then this is why these parties tend to be categorized as the far right. Now, these parties are also populist, but that's not their core attribute, and that's not their main characteristics. And in fact, it's also not the most dangerous attribute that these parties have, and also not the characteristic that warrants a specific response, I would say. So what does warrant a response, in my view, are far-right tendencies. So this belief that inequalities, whether they be economic, cultural, or racial, are somehow natural and positive. So this is something that does warrant a response. So what I want to do in the next few minutes or so is to think more about responses to this specific type of animal that I focus on in my work, namely populist radical right parties. Now, when we start picking apart this question of responses to the populist radical right, I think we need to do a bit of legwork first, and that is to think about who we is. So if we think about how should we respond to this, then we need to think about what type of actors are even capable of responding. And I think that the suitability of a response also depends on who it is that is responding. And there are different types of players in the running here that can be identified. We could be talking about mainstream parties. We could be talking about journalists or the media more generally. Are we maybe talking about civil society? Or when we are asking this question about responses, are we talking about us, the academy, right? The academic community? How should we as scholars respond? Now, in my research, I focus on 2 key players, mainstream parties and the media, the M&M, if you like. And for the purposes of this presentation, I also will focus on these because taken together in my research, I show that mainstream parties and the media act as gatekeepers in the sense that they control the entry into the electoral arena, and that gives them a specific responsibility, if you wish. Particularly in the early stages of party developments, they can actually play a really big role in determining the trajectories of populist radical right parties. Now, from a purely theoretical point of view, mainstream parties and the media have different options. And what I would like to do next is to theorize the way in which these two actors can respond, right? This is something political scientists like to do, is to think about a very complex reality and make it a bit more simple by theorizing this. There are different ways to theorize these responses, but in my work, I use these three terms: demarcation, confrontation, and accommodation. But one of the best metaphors for this is, I think it was Tim Bale who used this metaphor, snog, marry, or avoid, like from this British TV show, if you remember. That also works for kind of theorizing these responses. But first, let me just kind of walk you through what these three types of responses look like in theory. Now, first, media practitioners and mainstream politicians can opt for what I call here strict demarcation. Now, in the purest form, this strategy would mean to simply ignore these parties, but there are absolutely no countries where these parties are completely ignored. Instead, they can opt to treat these types of parties as outcasts. For instance, media outlets might choose not to invite or interview politicians who are associated with the far right, and that can be done by means of a cordon sanitaire. Now, since Corona, I never need to explain where that term comes from anymore. Cordon sanitaire is a medical term. It refers to a guarded line that is put in place to prevent the spread of infectious diseases. And in this case, it is a measure that is designed to prevent, so to speak, the spread of the far right. Now, what's really important is that the aim of this strategy is actually not to ignore these parties and the issues that they bring up, but to actually isolate them. In other words, demarcation here refers to differential treatment. The second strategy that mainstream parties and the media might assume is this more confrontational stance. So they might opt for an overtly critical stance towards populist radical right parties. And unlike the first strategy where these parties are not considered normal, in this strategy, they are just considered normal players who, just like any other party, have a legitimate reason for existing and should therefore be responded to as such. But here so mainstream parties and media practitioners might seek to actually distance themselves from populist radical right parties, for instance, by demonizing them, by stigmatizing them, or they might actually try to expose them, for instance, by making them show their true face so that they can delegitimize these policies through, for instance, unfavorable news coverage. Now, the third strategy that these parties and the media might adopt is what I call accommodation. Also, in Tim Bale's metaphor, that would be the snogging metaphor. Mainstream parties and the media can opt for this accommodative stance. And in this purest form, that would mean implying giving, for instance, direct access to far-right politicians by letting them write op-eds, or for mainstream politicians to go into coalition with populist radical right politicians, or incorporate some of their rhetoric into their own stances, paying excessive attention to the so-called silent majority, or focus excessively on the issues that are typically owned by populist radical right parties. Think about immigration, nationalism, or crime-related topics. Now, in my book, see how I can neatly plug my book here. In my book, I focused on 3 case studies: Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. These 3 countries are really nice laboratories to kind of test these 3 theories and strategies. And what I show in the book is essentially that the Netherlands and Flanders, so the northern Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, there you see that mainstream parties and the media have actually generated a very open electoral market. They have provided a very accessible environment for populist radical right parties to thrive. And there has been a clear shift over time from demarcation in the 80s and 90s to confrontation and now full-on accommodation. So they've sort of legitimized the existence of these parties and helped them break through. In Wallonia, so the French-speaking part of Belgium, and in Luxembourg, where these parties don't do so well, you see that mainstream parties and the media adhere to strict demarcation. And this really has limited the opportunity structures for populist radical right parties to thrive, to enter, to get foot on the ground. Now, one of the main conclusions that I draw from in the book is that the spread of right-wing populism is not simply a matter of accident or chance, it is ultimately a matter of choice. So it doesn't spread like a virus, even though this analogy works quite well. It actually only spreads if there are channels, so the media, or actors, mainstream parties, that helps these parties gain footholds into electoral systems. And that also means that the choices that mainstream parties and the media make play a really big role in the diffusion of right-wing populism. In other words, these two players that I highlight in this short presentation are not secondary players or even victims, right? They like to often see themselves as the victims of the rise of populism. They are key agents, especially in the early stages of development of right-wing populist parties. So to conclude, I think that we should not focus our time and energy on thinking about responses to populism, but more about the ways in which we can actually strengthen democracy. So as academics, I also think that we have a role to play in this. First, by thinking about how democracy can be strengthened. And second, by explaining time and again when, how, and why some populist parties pose a real threat to liberal democracy. Also setting clear limits to what is consistent with liberal democracy and what is not. So when that line is crossed, to also actually say, I won't compromise on that, and say, this is the limit to what we will tolerate and no further. Also, again, explaining time and again why democracy is worth defending in the first place, which should be a given, but really isn't a given. So that's actually worth explaining time and again. And then finally, also thinking about viable alternatives to the populist radical right, to not leave them the monopoly of discussion. And I think this is where I will stop, and I'm curious to see what others have to think about. Others think about this.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for the presentation and for sharing your insights and bringing your book in as well. Giorgos, may I hand over to you? And a quick reminder to the audience, you can already pose your questions in the Q&A function or note them down.
Okay, thank you, Kirk. Thank you, Leonie, for the great first inputs. So I'm going to be a bit old school. I just wrapped up teaching for the whole semester, and I honestly couldn't sit down and create another PowerPoint. So I just have some notes here, and I'm going to talk for about 12, 13, 14 minutes top. So please bear with this kind of old school style. So it's great to be here. Thank you to the organizers as well. You gave me a great opportunity to think back and reflect on a notion that I first used. I think it was back in 2010, 2011, when I started my PhD. Then I was struggling to find anything on it. I think back then I only found one paper, which was Pierre Ostigui, sometime 2009, and a couple of references of Laclau and anti-populism in his 2005 book. So if I were to give a title to my intervention, in a bit to make it a bit provocative as well, in a good sense, that would simply be anti-populism poses the wrong answers to the wrong questions. I'm hoping this will become clearer as I develop my thoughts on this. And of course, you can see the nod here to what is often said, that populism poses the wrong answers to the right questions. So to begin with, what do we mean by anti-populism? A minimal way to define it would be as, let's say, a principled opposition to populism, nice and simple. An opposition that can manifest in different forms and with varying intensities, from mere political disagreement with populists to some kind of existential struggle. Some tend to merely criticize populists and populism in general, while others claim that populism is something that should be eradicated as it threatens democracy in the same way that cancer threatens the human body. And here is where the problems for me, conceptual, analytical, political, and other kinds of problems immediately start to rise. So in order to develop a principled opposition to something, and for this to be a viable option to others, there needs to be some kind of clear and commonly accepted understanding of what this concept, what this phenomenon that we oppose is. And despite great progress in our field and then emerging consensus on the key characteristics of populism, I think that this commonly accepted understanding does not exist yet, at least in the broader public sphere. And as a result, anti-populism ends up being an empty cell with different actors, from political parties to public intellectuals and from the media to academics opposing all sorts of different phenomena, ideas and practices that they arbitrarily baptize as populism. And this can be truly anything: authoritarianism, illiberalism, xenophobia, when people criticize the far right, or very differently, state interventionism, social welfare policies, expansionary fiscal policies, you name it, when people criticize the populist left. It all depends on who is targeted and attacked as a populist. And in this sense, already I can say that anti-populist thus is not much of use. If this is more characteristic of the public sphere, discussions and commentary, which cannot be judged by scholarly standards and shouldn't be judged by scholarly standards, what about us? What about social scientists and our own stances in relation to populism? I'm afraid that things don't get any better for anti-populism here either, at least in my view. To be sure, we can argue that in our field, we now share at least a minimal consensus on what populism is, and I think that is great. Whether seen as a kind of discourse, as a thin ideology, or a style, or a strategy, we all agree now that what defines populism in the end is a strong emphasis on the people, some kind of privileging of the people and their common will or sovereignty on the one hand, and an opposition to an unresponsive elite or establishment on the other. Something that is often summarized as simply people-centrism / anti-elitism. I think this would be at the very core of most of the work that we're doing, regardless of our own approach or theoretical camp. If we accept this minimal definition of populism, then what would it mean to be anti-populist? If one opposes the first component, the first characteristics, that means denying or doubting the centrality of the people and the importance of popular sovereignty for democracy itself. This wouldn't be, of course, anything new, as suspicion, some kind of suspicion against the popular masses, the unruly mob, the irrational plebs, and so on, has been accompanying democracy ever since its emergence in ancient Athens. However, I think that when we talk about suspicion against the popular masses and what they involve, when we talk about that, we need to be clear about what this entails and what it has been associated with, and what the implications of these associations are. Now, to make it even clearer, this would refer simply to a spectrum of positions starting from oligarchy and aristocracy, if we go many centuries back, and moving on to elitism, technocracy, or some kind of post-democratic institutionalism in today's world. The anti-democratic slippery slope from anti-populism to undemocratic or plain anti-democratic positions becomes quickly apparent here. And I think it's crucial to remind ourselves also what is at the core of most literature here that we tend to forget. Margaret Canavan used to stress that populism is essentially democratic. What happens in its particular manifestations is a whole other story. Casmud and Christopher Vira-Calvasser start with that very assumption in their Oxford short introduction, that populism is essentially democratic, and this has to do with the emphasis on the popular component of democracy. Peter Mayer, in his posthumous masterpiece on the hollowing out of democracy, was also very aware of this, when he stressed that one should not forget that at the heart of democracy, we find two complementary and equally necessary components, the popular and the constitutional/institutional. And allow me a quote from Peter Mayer here, which I find brilliant. Start of quote, the constitutional component emphasizes the need for checks and balances across institutions and entails government for the people. The popular component emphasizes the role of the ordinary citizen and mass participation and entails government by the people. The two elements coexist and complement one another within a unified sense of democracy. Today, we see them being disaggregated and then contrasted. Government by the people comes to be judged against government for the people. And in this assessment, Peter Mayer concludes, it's usually popular democracy, the popular component of democracy, that is found at the losing side. It is this post-democratic or even plain elitist direction to which anti-populism would seem to contribute then. And I think that Kasmude as well is aware of this when he talks about the challenge that undemocratic liberalism poses to democracy today, and to which populism quite often reacts. But there are more possibilities here. So what about anti-populism being all about rejecting the second component of populism, so a principled opposition to the elites or some notion of the establishment, so being anti-elite. Again, this seems to create more problems than solving any. We know from Robert Dahl, whose democratic theory has been a common point of reference for many of us in the field, that one of the two most crucial elements or dimensions of liberal democracy is public contestation. Now, among other things, this concept refers to the development of an open and free system that allows political competition, disagreement, and debate, and very importantly, allows for the critiquing and challenging of executive power and of the ruling elites. In other words, if some kind of centrality of the people is already a defining characteristic of democracy, and this is in common with populism, then at least the possibility of adopting an anti-elite and anti-establishment position is equally important. It's a possibility that needs to remain open, as eradicating that option would effectively limit and undermine public contestation. So, once more, we return to the deterioration of anti-populism into undemocratic, illiberal, or even plainly anti-democratic position. So my argument up to now is based mostly on theoretical reflection and some logical deduction. It's quite simplistic. However, things remain interesting and rather problematic when we also look at the empirical manifestations of anti-populism within and beyond academia. The most important such problem, in my view, is the effect of euphemization. And I think this links back very nicely to what Leonie has been talking about, and with which I'm fully on board. So Etienne Balibar started a discussion about this back in 2010, 2011, a couple of articles. And we have also published a few relevant works along with Yannis Stavrakakis and some of our colleagues in Thessaloniki, starting from 2013 up to 2015 or so. But the scholar to whom I think we owe most when it comes to highlighting the problem of euphemization through the use of populism in anti-populist discourse is Aurélien Mondon, along with some of his colleagues like Aaron Winter and Katie Brown. The problem here is quite simple and presents challenges that have to do with theoretical, methodological, and analytical rigor. On the one hand, how good, how valid, how methodical our analysis are, but also on the normative and political implications. Because our work, we can go back to the W hermeneutics thesis of Giddens, has social implications. We're not merely observing the natural world. The world that we observe and write about actually reacts to our ideas, and we might be influencing politics. So we know very well from relevant research, starting from the great thrown around with abandon article of Van Kessen, Bale, and Taggart back in 2011, if I remember correctly, that populism is used and misused in myriads of different ways, often contradictory in public sphere in ways that do not actually talk to each other at all. And this often creates a kind of Babel Tower effect in the media and offers a convenient way of easy political point scoring to politicians and media commentators. Populism can mean anything, so anti-populism can be a critique of anything as well. However, more recent research has also shown that there are some notable patterns here that deserve our attention. Namely, there is a substantial tendency in both media and academic discourse to mislabel phenomena or certain characteristics usually associated with the far right, like racism, xenophobia, authoritarianism, illiberalism, or even plain extremism, fascism, neo-Nazism. And this is painfully familiar to me because of the relevant discussions about the Golden Dawn in Greece. And all of these have been consistently labeled as populism, even by some academics. I understand that this is sometimes a practical choice made out of fear or necessity, as in several occasions, parties of the far right in Europe have filed lawsuits or have initiated intimidation or trolling campaigns against journalists and scholars on social media because the latter simply expose the racist profile. So labeling them as populist might give an easy way out, allowing a critique that can still be valid, but limiting, however, the chances that those being critiqued will come after you with defamation allegations and so on. At least that is my well-meaning interpretation of one aspect of the phenomenon here. However, this has consequences. By labeling such actors as primarily populist, we are both obscuring the true nature and downplaying the threat that they pose to democracy and to open and pluralistic societies. We are also effectively painting them in a much more favorable light, euphemizing and legitimizing them. And this is why several actors of the far right have been so willing to claim the populist label for themselves. Whatever can draw attention away from their bigotry, intolerance, and authoritarianism is considered good for their public image. This is still an important problem in the literature, as we know how academic discourse is connected to media discourses, thus further amplifying relevant misconceptions in the public sphere instead of resolving them, scrutinizing and resolving them. Now, there's plenty of research to substantiate this common mislabeling and to reflect on its implications. So the question remains, why do we keep doing this? So there's no time to answer the question here, but what I can surely passionately argue is that we need to oppose that tendency of euphemizing the far right by using the populism label, which not only poses theoretical, analytical, and methodological challenges, but can also bear negative consequences for democracy, which I'm sure we all want to defend. So to go back to the main question of this event and start to wrap this up, is anti-populism the way to react to populism? I would say no, definitely no. Populism as a phenomenon is highly malleable and ideologically thin. There can never be a one-size-fits-all reaction to populism, as populist actors can and are advocating sharply different and often diametrically contradicting opposing worldviews and corresponding policies. How could anyone ever put in the same basket of anti-populist critique Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders? We can discuss why that would be quite absurd. So the pressing question, the question that we need to answer today, and I think here I'm concluding along almost the same lines as Leonie did, the question that we need to answer is, how do we deal with democracy's challenges and impasses in today's highly unstable world? How do we make democratic systems more representative, more inclusive, more participatory, and more appealing to citizens? How do we respond to re-emerging racism, which, by the way, as Mondon and Winter show in their latest book, comes in both liberal and illiberal forms? There's liberal and illiberal racism. How do we respond to authoritarianisms within the EU, as exemplified in the case of Hungary? How do we respond to and counter the mainstreaming of far-right ideas and policies as seen in mainstream parties of the center-right, in conservatives and Christian Democrats, but also of the liberal center? Remember here Macron's the interior minister of Macron recently calling Le Pen too soft on Islam, the kind of legitimizing effect of anti-Islamism that this has when coming from an allegedly liberal centrist politician. How do we respond to homophobia, to emboldened patriarchy, and climate crisis denialism? And I'm not merely trying to end up with a kind of pro-democratic manifestation here. All the concepts that I've mentioned here as challenges are also concepts that have been mislabeled as populist, but I prefer to talk about this with their own name. When we talk about racism, I think we really need to talk about racism. When we talk about authoritarianism, we really need to talk about authoritarianism, not some kind of proxy, whether that is populism or otherwise. These are the real challenges. And I'm afraid that anti-populism, academic or otherwise, is only drawing attention away from these issues that really matter and need our attention. On the contrary, it is actually certain forms of progressive, egalitarian, and pluralistic populism that can be our allies to those causes. And I will end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for 3 great presentations. It was a pleasure to listen to all 3. So what I mean, a couple of things. We were going to give maybe the panelists a chance to respond to each other, to get this a real panel discussion. But I see that Paul Taggart has jumped in and he's got to go. So I thought maybe if we answer his question or begin to answer his question, we can convince him to stay. And it's always nice to have Paul stay. So Paul asks, is there a danger that focusing on anti-populism means buying into the populist dichotomizing of politics, and so into the Manichaean notion of politics? Why don't I leave that to the panelists to answer, and we could answer, if you want to, we could answer in the same order that we started, maybe, since Kirk has been so quiet, maybe he'd like to jump in, and then Leonie and through, or if you don't have an answer, that's also allowed. We're not going to force you into dichotomizing. Yeah. Go ahead, Kirk. Yeah.
I appreciated the responses in some ways that I think Leonie and Giorgos have already given to that, which I agree with. So as I approached this, I got the invitation. I thought, what do they mean by anti-populism? I mean, is it like a populist response to populism, or is it sort of this sort of bland technocratic response? So yeah, that is a little tricky, and I think that in a bit of the spirit of what Leonie has done, you'd want to be able to say, oh, well, there's an array of responses, a menu of things that we can do. I mean, I think, though, Paul's point is still lying there, and that's the point being made by the others today too, which is, I mean, some of these responses aren't healthy or useful and supportive of democracy in a variety of ways. And so I would say, yeah, we should recognize the diversity of responses that actually exists, but I think as much for sort of scholarly and pragmatic reasons as anything, because some are better than others. So
yeah, okay, good. Leonie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just really quickly, that I saw right through Paul, that wasn't really a question, but more of a comment. But I mean, yeah, I fully agree. I think it's one of the things that I said early on in the presentation, that this anti-populist response is often motivated by these, that there are some pitfalls in the logic there. And I think Giorgos' presentation was great in pointing those out. Maybe one thing that I think is interesting is that Kirk, of course, coming from the US perspective, that there's this anti-populist reaction, this almost allergic anti-populist reaction is really, I would say, a specific European thing. But maybe that's wrong, but that's just my impression, right? I think that anti-populism, it immediately made me ring some alarm bells, whereas maybe coming from US perspective and looking at Latin America, that is not so much. Of course, the diagnosis is often different. Populism isn't so pathologized as it is maybe in Europe, but that's just an observation and maybe also a comment phrased as a question.
Cool. And Giorgos, do you want to respond as well?
Yeah, of course. So the twist I would like to add here is that we shouldn't, I mean, there is an issue of accepting antagonism, mediated antagonism in politics. And for this, I will go back to the work of Chantal Mouffe and the notion of agonistic pluralism and mediating, transforming antagonism into agonism, which means being able to oppose each other, even very passionately, very radically, but while accepting the legitimacy of one another to oppose different views. So it's not really a matter of fully buying into the populist dichotomization of politics that Paul mentions, because this again is done in different ways. there are different kinds of populism and different kinds of antagonism populism poses. So for me, what is crucial here is to be able to differentiate between the kind of competition between enemies on the one hand and the kind of competition between legitimate opponents. And this is something that both populists and anti-populists do. And when opponents are turned into enemies that should eradicate one another, I think this is equally dangerous, whether it comes from a liberal technocrat or from a populist. And in this sense, I think that we should start treating, it is really high time that we start treating populism as normal politics. It's one among the many ways to construct collective identities and to oppose named opponents. The way that this is done varies to a great extent. And the same rules that apply to different styles of politics apply to populism and apply to anti-populism. And I think that it was great that in his latest piece, Cas Mudde has a tiny paragraph on anti-populism, and he highlights how anti-populism tends to be articulated as a caricature or as a mirror image of the caricature that it creates on populism. So anti-populist tends to be Manichaean, moralistic, it tends to be anti-pluralist by homogenizing populists as one, undifferentiated, and so on and so forth. So I would add that there are several layers that we could unpack here, but this is definitely a question worth discussing further.
Okay, cool. We have Carla would like to ask a question, and Robert, you're going to open her mic for her, I think. Yeah.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Giorgos, and all the others I don't know personally, but nice to hear you all speak. It was very interesting, and I'm really curious to hear Leonie and Giorgos ask, because I really agree that you should address like right extremism for what it is, as being right extremists. But especially now in the Netherlands, the problem is that all mainstream parties are so like anti-political. So like all politicians are sort of corrupt, bad, or yeah, doing everything wrong in first place. So how do you react to that? Because I think that is really a populist a problem, that if you see all politicians as bad people, what's left of democracy? So that's my question.
Leonie, I see you wanting to start.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. It made me think of this, the fact that I saw somewhere a statistic that politicians are now even less popular than second-hand car salesmen. So I think that there is really something to it, right? And it speaks to this democratic malaise that is really happening, that is legitimately happening. And but I think that politicians to some extent have themselves to blame for this. I want to come back to the fact that the diagnosis here is the rise of populism can to a large extent be explained by mainstream parties failing to really listen to what the people have to say. Well, I sound like a real populist now too, but I think there is some legitimate concern there that politicians did really fail to respond to the great questions of our time. They did really fail to offer responses to satisfy people. So there is reason to be deeply dissatisfied with mainstream politicians and the political class in general. So I think, but you're right. So now the question is how to get out of that. And I think that to some extent, mainstream politicians can learn something from the populists. They can learn to at least bring to the fore the issues that people are really hearing and feeling. So yeah, I think I'm just thinking out loud, but I think that there is a legitimate, I mean, I'm also sometimes angry at the political class, and I think that is not the real problem. I think that anger is good. It needs to be channeled in some way that is constructive and that brings those politicians again in line with why people are so angry.
Should I jump in?
I was reading a message, but I couldn't find my mute. Okay, go ahead, Giorgos.
Okay, so I think that this is a very interesting question, and it brings us both back to the problem of the moralization of politics, which is something that actually Santalmov brought up in 2000, was it, in the Democratic Paradox, as a side effect of post-political consensus. So because this is something that we saw very, very vividly back the golden years of the consensus of the third way and centrist politics of Tony Blair and Gerhard Schroeder, when politics left and right didn't matter anymore, and whether you oppose this kind of new technocratic centrist politics, it was an opposition of good versus bad, because politics didn't matter. So antagonist competition had migrated to the moral register, as Santalmov showed back then. And the moralization of politics is something that we need to combat. Ethics, morals, to some extent, always contaminate politics, and it's actually a good thing. Because we fight for what we consider a good cause. There is always an opposition between good versus bad. However, when politics is totally subsumed in morals and totally reduced into this kind of moralistic claims, this is, for me, when problems arise. And this is definitely an issue. On the other hand, I think that this also exposes certain deficiencies, certain problems of theories around populism that view moral claims as problematic, because I think they aren't. Sometimes the mainstream is corrupt, is truly corrupt, and this needs to be exposed. And this is part of the public contestation thesis that we find in Robert Dahl. We should be able to make a claim that the political elites are corrupt and incompetent when indeed they are. We saw this quite a lot in the initial stage of the rise of Podemos. And we know now that allegations about corruption were actually pretty accurate. We've seen this in the Partido Popular. A government fell because of these scandals of corruption. We saw the same thing in Greece when Syriza was making allegations about corruption. People actually, former ministers of PASOK actually went in jail. So weren't they supposed to say anything about the corruption of the political elites when it was clearly an issue that was concerning people? So this is a second note. We shouldn't demonize moral claims in politics as long as they are not the only thing going around, and as long as there is concrete policy to back this up. And the third point is what do we do today, because I think this is what concerns Carola. When we reach a state that corruption is so widespread, even incompetence, we see this in other countries as well. Have a look at the UK. And I think that here, concrete policies really do matter. It is never enough to suggest that political elites are corrupt. What do we do about it? A different ethos of politicization and concrete policies that would counter, prevent, and check corruption and tendencies towards corruption are absolutely vital, and they're vital to restoring the trust of citizens into not just politicians and political parties, but the institutions of democracy in itself. Because frustrations and grievances tend to boil down in distrust towards democratic institutions themselves, and this becomes a very, very serious problem. Hope this makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Hey, Kirk, do you want to respond as well? To give you a chance.
Sure. Yeah, Carola, it's a pleasure to meet you. And I love a lot of what's been said. I do think that there's a, I don't know, I think there's a tendency to hold politicians to much higher standards than we hold ourselves. And while I look at the past and the mistakes that have been made in terms of these failures of democratic representation, I just would remind us, populism is actually periodic. It accompanies democracy all the time. And there's a reason for that. I mean, not just because it's inherent in a vision of a belief in popular sovereignty, but the other side of that is that we all make mistakes, and politicians, just like us as scholars, will push positions and issue positions and ideologies. Will promote something and do so at the expense of perhaps of people. We don't see the losers of policy, the policies we enact. And that's maybe something that happened. It is something that happened in Europe and the United States and parts of Latin America that I study. But, that always happens. And so it's this idea of populism as a corrective, and that it's kind of constantly necessary. But the flip side of that then is recognizing that politicians will always get things wrong, just like you and I do. And I think the problem comes not that we got things wrong in the past, but if we say, I'm not willing to correct now. So if I'm not willing to look and say, what was wrong with my policies in the past? What was wrong with globalization? And who's getting left behind by these things, both economic and cultural globalization? And so to me, the more important thing is not, they messed up in the past, but because they're always going to, we always will. Populism happens because we make mistakes and we don't get representation perfect. But the ability to correct and continually correct and move on, I think that's really essential. And what Giorgos has been talking about, that need for a system that allows debate and juxtaposing opposing sides and views is part of that process of having a healthy democracy where we can discover policy mistakes and fix them.
Cool, 3 really good answers. Okay, Annika asked me that she's got 25 questions, but she can't ask 25. But before we get to Annika, there's one more question from the public, and it's anonymous, so I can't give anybody credit. But it says, if we only criticize the radical messages and not the populist style itself, don't we miss out on containing a healthy democratic discussion style, or at least a debate about what it is? Does political style matter as well? Nice question. Maybe Leonie, you were nodding the hardest, so I'll give it to you. I don't know, arbitrary.
I need to stop giving away like I have answers.
I know,
it's more like, it's a great question.
Listener. So then the other 2 can jump in.
Yeah, no, just initially I thought, that this kind of ties in, I think, to something Kirk said in the beginning about sort of mediation and thinking about how to have a fruitful discussion. I think absolutely I would agree this, I think, also goes back to the fact that there are limits to how far we should tolerate the discussion to go. I think, yes, you should be able to say anything and bring everything up, but it should be done in a style and in a way that is respectful and that allows for dialogue. And it can be radical and it can be loud, but there are limits. For instance, when it becomes sexist, racist, xenophobic, I think there is then where when it becomes discriminatory, then there should be clear limits set, and that should not be allowed for a fruitful discussion in a healthy democracy.
Cool. Kirk, Giorgos? Giorgos, why don't you go first? Yeah.
Happy to add something very quickly.
Yeah, of course.
So fully on board with Leonie, with one caveat with regards to the question, not what Leonie just said. Style, the performative elements of politics, of course, do matter. But I would like to play the devil's advocate here with regards to how far we go when criticizing certain styles that might seem improper or disruptive or not formal enough according to our standards. Part of democratic representation has to do with style, the way that politicians speak, dress, and so on. And the vast majority of politicians actually do not represent the majority of the population in several countries. They represent middle, upper class, really wealthy people, and so on and so forth. And this, for me, is important. And I think that Pierre Ostigui is making some great claims in his more socio-cultural approach to populism, where he's talking about the low in politics. And I think that we actually need disruptive and improper styles in politics, and that this can help have better, more effective symbolic representation of the popular classes, as long as it doesn't cross some boundaries in terms of content. Of course, we draw the boundary in sexist, racist, whatever other behavior. But it's actually good to be loud, to not be dressed fully properly. And usually critiques of the improper hide some kind of elitism. Remember the way that Cameron spoke to Jeremy Corbyn in the House of Commons. Go wear a tie, wear a suit, shave, become proper and come back, something like that. I remember the way that people have been criticizing Alexis Tsipras in Greece for not wearing a tie. supposed to be some kind of great scandal. So style does matter, but there is also the flip side. Disruptive, improper styles can help improve symbolic representation in democracies. It's good that people can see themselves in the political class.
Kirk, before we turn to Annika's 25 questions.
Maybe this is a little bit coming from my American perspective, but free speech here is very free. And there have been long been some of the strongest constitutional guarantees are for freedom of speech, and that includes a lot of style questions, for example. I'm sympathetic to. I even wonder how much of the opposing views we kind of need to tolerate and listen to, I mean, and this goes both ways. I may hear, here we have this real question, like, so what do I do with someone who's a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and there actually are public spaces where we allow them to speak. We say, hey, if you want to have a rally or demonstration, okay, as long as you follow the rules. And so the rules here are actually fairly constrained. They'll say, you can go ahead and do that, but for example, just like anybody else, you can't destroy public buildings. You got to stay on the street that you've got your permit for, and you got to let that happen. And I think you need to let that happen on both sides. I'm really concerned about saying certain views can't be expressed. I'm a bit more concerned about the way they're expressed, right? So, for example, if my expression shuts off someone else and prevents them from speaking, or if I actually use violence, then I say, no, that crossed a boundary. So I think for me, the boundaries are a little further away than Leonie and Giorgos have talked about. Although, yeah, I mean, you do have to have some boundaries, but I'd want to make them shrink the boundaries a little bit more. And allow a bit more of that expression. So not just allowing, sort of loud styles, but maybe even some things I don't want to hear, but creating a space for people to be able to say those, even if I don't like them.
This is generated. Okay, Leonie and Giorgos respond, and Annika, you have to wait. Yeah.
No, I totally see where you're coming from, Kirk. I just thought that one of the reasons why I think that we should set clear boundaries to what we will tolerate is that if we don't do that, then we often let the far right determine where those boundaries are. And what we're seeing now is this normalization of these far right thoughts, and that it becomes at some point acceptable because they get to set the limit. And this is why also in my work, right, when I talk to journalists, I always say, it's really important that you know where your editorial line is. Like, I'm not the one to set it, but I think that everyone for themselves should set that line and should make it explicit and have that as a sort of rule that you wake up to and go by every day. Because the risk of saying sort of, yeah, I sort of think there are some limits, but they should be a bit further than not sort of explicitly saying where those limits are, that then risks pushing that limit further and further, and that's really how we ended up in the situation that we are now. Although again, I also think that this sort of what I'm calling for is not to ignore or to silence certain views, but to really isolate them and say, okay, some views, yes, the Ku Klux Klan can get together somewhere, but then they don't have a right to also be heard in public.
Oh, I want to respond so badly, but I'm gonna stop. Okay, Giorgos and then Annika. Okay.
So Leonie pretty much covered what I wanted to say. So just to make it clear, because I also have the lived experience of the Golden Dawn in Greece, and the more the state tolerated their expression, the more they pushed the boundary. And the more that boundary was pushed, that discursive boundary, the more discourse turned into violence and the actual beating up of people and the actual killing of people. So I like to have my boundaries quite clear. And for me, the style that things are being said is much less important than what is being said. It is that what is being said that put the limit, and I would prefer that some things are not said at all. For example, I would prefer that people, that Jews or any other kind of people should be exterminated. I would prefer that people do not say that at all. I really don't care at all about the style. I would like this to not be said. And certain other views that create actually threatening and dangerous conditions for other people in society and could lead to violent acts, I would immediately put the boundary there. So, and I know that the freedom of expression is a very, very complex and complicated thing, but I think that also that we have too painful and too recent experiences with what the freedom of speech of that kind can entail. So we need to be very cautious here. And the other point is, and I'm not saying Kirk said anything about it, but it's related to the discussion. So Kirk, at some point you mentioned, I like to push the boundaries of discourse at both sides. And it immediately comes to mind discussions that I've heard in Greece and at other parts of Europe. And I know that there are discussions like this in the US, starting to say, to talk about freedom of expression, what can be said at the far right and at the far left. And I'm really wondering about what those limits at the far left could be. So the far right suggesting that certain people should be beaten up and killed, and the far left suggesting that we seize the means of production and we have an anarchic society. I don't think we can make this kind of balanced arguments about both sides. At least in my side, all those arguments about ethnic cleansing and so on are much more terrifying than nationalizing a bank or seizing the means of production. And again, this refers to the broader discussion, not something that has been said here, just to be perfectly clear.
Okay, Annika.
I'll try to limit myself.
Go for it. Yeah.
Having been born in the GDR, I can talk about the danger of the unlimited on the left-hand side and the nationalization of the means of production, etc. But we can do that on another time. But I want to, I have so many points, but I think my main one is actually I want to push back against both Leonie and Giorgos and your argument that populism is not really the problem, because from what I understood you to say, and which in Giorgos it came out really clearly, is that you focus very narrowly when it comes to populism on this kind of, there's the popular will and then the anti-elitism. But actually, when we think back to Kirk's pluralist strategies against populism, that was a strategy against the Manichaean aspect of it. And that from my perspective, that's the really dangerous one. It's the black and white, friend or foe, the delegitimization of other voices. And I think here too, we have to think about consequences, right? I mean, that sort of goes into sort of that kind of leads it to like polarization, uncivility. Basically, it's a path to illiberalism. It's kind of, this whole logical breakdown of civil communication that comes with that kind of black and white view. And I mean, isn't that what makes populism, no matter whether it's radical right, whether it comes with, a dangerous host ideology, or whether it comes with centrism or with whatever other ideology? Isn't that what makes it so dangerous, that it basically takes away the legitimacy of political contestation, and therefore the very idea on which democracy is, and especially liberal democracy is built. And to Kirk's idea on this pluralist strategy, it really reminds me of the ideals of deliberative democracy. and this kind of communication space that the deliberative democracy people kind of try to open up, to have very open, very equal, very respectful kind of communication. And because I was reminded of that sort of field, I was also wondering for your kind of strategy, and whether you're sort of on the path of constructing a kind of idealized communicative space that actually might clash with the logics of political conflict. Because basically, if the ideal is that we all say, I listen to you, what you have to say, I try to find kind of, try to see your point of view, can we still have political contestation where you get, parties or leaders who construct very clear kind of policies and ideologies, and then say, vote for me, don't vote for the other. If I as a presidential candidate say, yes, this other person has this other candidate has completely legitimate, very kind of rational and positions, I understand what they're saying, how can I then make this jump off, but you should still vote for me and not for the other person? I wonder how that goes together. And I'll stop there.
Okay, very nice intervention. Okay, do you, yeah, I don't know, I leave it to you guys. Pluralism, jump in, yeah. I've lost control, yeah.
Okay. I think Leonie nodded towards my way, so I will do the first one. So Annika, thank you very much for this. So I guess this has to do with the understandings that we have of populism. So I based my intervention based on what I understand as the minimal common, let's say, nucleus of understanding. We don't all agree that populism is necessarily homogenizing, moralistic, or antagonistic in a sense of totally black and white. And this is something that I try to communicate in my intervention. I can return to it briefly here. So for me, the kind of Manichaeanism that totally delegitimatizes opponents is a problem, and is a problem in the political sphere across the board, populist and non-populist, and we should combat it. This is at the very heart of Chantal Mouffe's work on on agonistic pluralism, and Chantal Mouffe is also a self-described left populist. So there you have it. You can have forms of populism that accept the legitimacy of their opponents. You can look at Podemos, you can look at Syriza in the European experience. If you want to look at antagonistic Manichaean discourses in Europe that totally delegitimize their opponents, I can only refer to the party that is currently in power in Greece, which is a conservative party called New Democracy, self-proclaimed anti-populists, liberal center right. And the Minister of Interior had proclaimed that if they come to power, they will do anything they can in changing the institutions to ensure that the left does never return to power. So there you have a very dangerous black and white Manichaean view of society, totally demonizing the left, and even the authoritarian element of openly saying that we will use institutions to exclude political views that we don't like. And this is not to say that populists of all kinds do not use that. They do, but not all of them do. Manichaeanism and the property of not accepting the other's legitimacy to have a different opinion is a problem that we should face across the board. And this is what I mean when I say that we need to treat populism as normal politics. This means that we judge populists with normal standards, but we don't let other politicians off the hook. What happens with mainstream parties when they delegitimize opponents and where they moralize political competition to a great extent and they try to exclude others? This is quite common. And I can only refer you to the latest collective volume. I think it's edited by Tim Bale and Cristobal Rovira Calvasser, who are looking at transformations within the mainstream right. They're using the populist label in the title in a way that I don't fully agree, but I think it's an absolutely brilliant volume. And they really are spot on with some aspects of that transformation. So I would say that this is not specific to populism. It's a problem, it's a challenge to democracy that we should deal with. But why try to apply it to everyone across the board when empirically it is simply not the case? Polarization, incivility, and so on, I would simply say the same thing. Polarizing strategies are something that we see across the political spectrum. And I will leave it to here, so Leonie can also jump in.
Go ahead, Leonie, and then Kirk can finish our session on.
Yeah, no, thanks, Annika, for this really good question. I think I can go along with your reasoning if we take that as to be the definition of populism, right? That you say the danger of populism, and then you're really doing what I think we should do, is to put your finger on the sore spot and say this is exactly where it gets problematic, is to say that populists have this claim to the monopoly of representation. So to say that we, and only we, so sort of I, the people, right? I am the only sort of true voice of the people, and it doesn't leave any room for any other views. And then it becomes anti-pluralist, and that then is a danger. I think there we fully agree. But then I have trouble seeing to what extent left-wing populists are really deeply anti-pluralist. So to what extent they really do say that that they really are exclusive towards all other legitimate voices. But your diagnosis is that I do fully agree that that is where it becomes tricky and itchy and dangerous, and that there the alarm bells should go off, and to say that, yes, when there are politicians, whether we call them populist or whatnot, that make calls to be the sort of, to have the monopoly on representation, to be the only true legitimate voice of representation, and by extension then to delegitimize any opposition, yes, that becomes problematic. And there I think that red flags should be raised by people in the academy, by the media, by all those sort of watchdogs of democracy, to say this is where it becomes itchy. So I would fully agree with that. I'm not sure if that's really what populism is. And I think maybe the question becomes, the real problem is anti-pluralist calls. And then if that's, then the question is, what's the best response to remedy anti-pluralism? And then I think that's a nice sort of segue to Kirk.
Wow, God, are you guys good. Kirk, that you're on board, yeah, to finish it out.
Yeah. By the way, as a little note, I mean, because I really like what's been said so far, but I would correct a little bit the view of left populism and where it stands and how populist it is. As we've looked at the content, the strength of the populism in the European populist left, honestly, it's pretty tepid as far as populism goes. So so it's so in some ways this takes Giorgos's account and flips on its head by saying, actually, I don't know that a lot of what we call left populism in Europe right now is highly populist. It has a lot of it, and as we've coded these, they'll often be like in the middle of the scale, and it's really there, but there are Latin Americas where I go to if I want to see some really strong populists to the left who start to really embody now this anti-liberal extremism, and it becomes a problem, and they head in a very undemocratic direction. So so in some ways it's an empirical question, right? I mean, yeah, how populist are they? Because if they are, though, I think they go a bad way. And Annika, I think that's your point. I really agree with it. And I think that's why we do still need to focus on populism per se. But your question for me, yeah, where do we go with this? And practically speaking, what can a candidate do, right, if they want to stake a claim and show a difference between themselves and their opponents? Clearly, they need to. I think we've got. In some ways, I think this is a little too academic, because I look around me and I see a lot of examples of politicians who manage this very well. And So Biden in his 2020 campaign was somebody who came across as somebody who was not populist particularly. And he made a point of that. And part of that, I think, kind of comes from with him and his personality and his long experience. He did not want to be that. And so at the same time, I mean, you know, and maybe sometimes a little too crazy anti-Trump, but I think he was managing that pretty well in that campaign. So yeah, the idea that this shouldn't just become some sort of love fest where we ignore differences of opinion. And I think, though, I guess there are different places where we go to, right? So there's a campaign, and when I say and do an electoral campaign to set myself apart, there's another when I'm debating with somebody, say on the chamber of my legislature. There's another when I talk with my neighbor about things. And I think they probably require a little finessing each of those settings, you know, what this looks like in practice. So it can't just be one homogenous sort of, you know, way of talking everywhere. I think that's right. And again, I think you're right to press me and others on what that kind of conversation looks like in different settings.
Cool. Thank you very much. Robert, I give the floor to you.
Excellent. So let me wrap up not only this session, but this season. And this was precisely the fantastic end to a really exciting season that we were looking for. So we really, really enjoyed the different perspectives on anti-populism today. And thank you not only to you and who presented today, but also to the audience who asked these interesting questions and make this a quite lively discussion. We're currently exploring different ways of moving forward the seminar in the next month. So stay connected with us through our Twitter account or through our website. But one thing that we can announce is that we will have an in-person meeting at ECPR to have a more informal setting to get a drink or two and exchange a bit. So let me really take this opportunity to thank everybody who participated this season. This was a fantastic season. I'm trying to the bottom. I think I speak for Annika and Andre and Maurits, obviously, as well. So thanks a lot and have a lovely rest of the day.